December 14, 1942. Leeuwarden Airfield, Netherlands. German salvage crews stood beside a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress bearing the name Wolfhound painted across its nose. The bomber sat intact in the cold morning light, its American star markings already covered by hastily applied German crosses. Inside the aircraft's nose compartment, protected by an armoured cover and secured with steel pins, rested America's most closely guarded secret. The Norden bombsight. Oberleutnant Hans-Dieter Vogel, a Luftwaffe technical intelligence officer with a doctorate in mechanical engineering from Berlin Technical University, approached the bomber with a mix of professional curiosity and ideological certainty. American propaganda claimed this device could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. German intelligence had spent years attempting to penetrate the extraordinary security surrounding the Norden program. Now, through the simple fortune of a damaged bomber making an emergency landing, one sat before him, ready for examination. What Vogel could not have known as he climbed into the bomber's nose that morning was that this examination would reveal one of the war's greatest ironies. The legendary American secret weapon was no secret at all. 2 days later, on December 16, 1942, Wolfhound touched down at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary test and evaluation center located 25 kilometers north of Berlin. The bomber arrived under fighter escort, with every Luftwaffe base along the flight path notified to avoid shooting down this valuable prize. The Norden bombsight, carefully removed from the aircraft and packed in protective casing, travelled separately under armed guard to the Rechlin Technical Laboratory. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The scene at Rechlin's technical facility that morning captured perfectly the mythology surrounding the Norden. Engineers from Carl Zeiss, specialists from the Reich Air Ministry, and senior Luftwaffe officers gathered in a secure laboratory as technicians carefully unpacked the American device. The Norden Mark 15 bombsight consisted of two primary components: a large stabilization platform weighing approximately 15 pounds, and the optical sight head with its intricate analog computer weighing another 35 pounds. The device looked impressive. Polished aluminum housings contained precision gyroscopes spinning at 7,200 revolutions per minute, complex gear trains, dozens of carefully machined parts, and delicate optical elements all testified to sophisticated American manufacturing capability. The sheer complexity seemed to justify every rumor about the device's legendary accuracy and the extraordinary security measures protecting it. Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner, a former Carl Zeiss optical engineer now serving in the Luftwaffe technical branch, conducted the initial examination. His background in precision optical instruments and bombsight development made him ideally qualified to assess American technology. As he studied the Norden's construction, photographing components and measuring tolerances, a troubling familiarity began to emerge. The gyroscopic stabilization system used principles Steiner had seen before. The optical sight head employed mirror arrangements and telescope magnification similar to existing German designs. The analog computer calculating bomb trajectories operated on mathematical principles identical to those in German bombsights. Every fundamental concept in the Norden had direct equivalents in German technical knowledge. By late afternoon on December 17, 1942, after 12 hours of detailed examination, Steiner composed his preliminary technical report. The opening paragraph contained an observation that would trigger immediate investigation by German intelligence services. The American Norden bombsight demonstrates advanced precision manufacturing and sophisticated gyroscopic stabilization. However, the underlying technical principles show remarkable similarity to German bombsight development programs, particularly the Carl Zeiss Luftfernrohr 7 series. This similarity suggests either parallel development or possible information transfer. The investigation began within 48 hours. Abwehr counterintelligence officers reviewed classified files related to pre-war German intelligence operations against American military technology programs. What they uncovered confirmed what technical analysis had already suggested. Germany had possessed complete technical specifications for the Norden bombsight since November 1938. The story began in 1933, when Hermann Wolfgang Lang immigrated to the United States from Germany. Born in Württemberg in 1901, Lang had completed technical training as a precision mechanic before economic conditions drove him to seek opportunities in America. He arrived in New York in 1927, worked various manufacturing jobs, and became a naturalized American citizen in 1939. In 1933, Lang obtained employment at the Carl L. Norden Company factory on Lafayette Street in Lower Manhattan. The company, founded by Dutch-born engineer Carl Norden, manufactured precision instruments for the United States Navy, including the top-secret Norden bombsight. Lang's technical skills and precision work ethic earned him promotion to assembly inspector, a position providing access to complete bombsight specifications, engineering drawings, and manufacturing procedures. Lang's access coincided with growing German intelligence interest in American military aviation technology. Colonel Nikolaus Ritter, chief of Luftwaffe intelligence operations for the Abwehr, had established an extensive espionage network targeting American aircraft manufacturers, engine developers, and precision instrument makers. The Norden bombsight represented a primary intelligence objective, given American claims about its revolutionary capabilities and the extraordinary security surrounding the program. In 1937, Lang was recruited by the Duquesne spy ring, a German intelligence network operating throughout the northeastern United States under the direction of Fritz Joubert Duquesne, a South African-born naturalized American citizen whose hatred of Britain motivated his cooperation with German intelligence. Lang's motivation appeared to be ideological rather than financial, viewing his espionage as service to Germany rather than betrayal of America. During a visit to Germany in November 1938, Lang met with Colonel Ritter in Hamburg. Over several days, Lang reconstructed complete technical drawings of the Norden bombsight from memory, providing specifications, dimensions, materials, and operating procedures. His technical training and daily work with bombsight components enabled him to reproduce documentation with remarkable accuracy, delivering to German intelligence a complete blueprint of America's most protected military secret. Ritter immediately forwarded Lang's information to Carl Zeiss in Jena, Germany's leading optical manufacturer and primary bombsight developer. Zeiss engineers studied the Norden specifications with great interest, analyzing American design approaches and comparing them to German bombsight programs already under development. Back at Rechlin in late December 1942, this historical context transformed how German engineers viewed the captured Norden bombsight. They were not examining unknown American technology. They were comparing an actual device to specifications German engineers had studied for 4 years, and evaluating how American design choices compared to German solutions for identical technical problems. Hauptmann Steiner's detailed technical analysis continued through January 1943. He systematically disassembled the Norden, documenting every component, measuring every dimension, and comparing actual construction to the specifications Lang had provided. The match was exact in all fundamental aspects, confirming that Lang's information had been accurate and complete. The Norden bombsight operated on principles that German engineers understood thoroughly. The device calculated bomb trajectories by measuring the aircraft's ground speed, comparing it to airspeed to determine wind effects, and computing the precise moment for bomb release to hit a target. Gyroscopic stabilization kept the optical sight pointed steadily at the target despite aircraft motion. Connection to the aircraft's autopilot allowed the bombsight to actually fly the bomber during the final approach, maintaining constant speed and heading for maximum accuracy. These concepts were not revolutionary. German bombsights employed identical principles. What differed was the specific engineering implementation and the degree of complexity German designers had accepted in pursuit of those principles. The Carl Zeiss Luftwaffe 7, or Luftwaffe 7, had entered Luftwaffe service starting in 1942, replacing earlier simpler bombsights. The Luftwaffe 7C variant, appearing in January 1941, featured gyroscopic stabilization directly comparable to the Norden. German engineers had developed this system independently, though knowledge of Norden's basic approach likely influenced some design decisions. Steiner's comparative analysis documented fundamental differences in design philosophy that revealed much about American versus German engineering approaches. The Norden consisted of two separate major components, the stabilization platform and the optical sight head. Both were complex mechanisms requiring separate maintenance, calibration, and careful handling. The two units connected through mechanical linkages and electrical cables, creating multiple potential points of failure. The Luftwaffe 7 employed a dramatically different approach. German engineers had integrated stabilization, optics, and computation into a single metal housing with a tube extending downward, containing a mirror that reflected the target image upward into a telescope in the main unit. This unified design simplified construction, reduced weight, and eliminated the complex connections between separate components that characterized the Norden. The operational differences proved equally significant. The Norden required extensive pre-flight preparation. Before use, the bombardier had to right the stabilization platform, a time-consuming process of comparing the platform's attitude to spirit levels, visible through a glass window. This calibration procedure took 10 to 15 minutes under ideal conditions, longer in cold weather or rough air. Once properly set up, the bombardier entered initial data for altitude, speed, and direction, then used the optical sight to locate and track the target. The Luftwaffe 7 simplified this process considerably. The bombardier could begin operations much more quickly, with simpler controls consisting primarily of three large knurled knobs for aim adjustment. The entire system could be operated single-handed, a critical advantage in single-seat aircraft like the Arado R-234 jet bomber, where the pilot had to handle all flying and bombing duties without a dedicated bombardier. Another significant difference emerged in target acquisition methods. The Norden's optical system viewed targets at an angle behind the aircraft's flight path. The bombardier had to first locate a reference point ahead of the actual target, use that for initial calculations, then transfer aim to the actual target. This indirect approach worked adequately but added complexity to the bombing procedure. The Luftwaffe 7 could view targets directly ahead of the aircraft, from 90 degrees to 40 degrees forward and up to 20 degrees on either side. The bombardier aimed directly at the actual target from initial acquisition through bomb release, simplifying the process and reducing opportunities for error. German test pilots flew the captured B-17 extensively through early 1943, evaluating not just the bombsight but the entire American bombing system. They discovered that American designers had created tight integration between the Norden bombsight and the aircraft's C-1 autopilot, marketed together as the Automatic Flight Control Equipment, or AFCE. This integration allowed the bombsight to actually fly the aircraft during the bombing run, making continuous corrections to maintain precise heading and speed. This represented genuine innovation that impressed German engineers. The Luftwaffe 7 connected to German autopilot systems, but the integration was less sophisticated. American engineers had created a true automated bombing system, where the bombardier simply tracked the target optically, while the bombsight handled all calculations and aircraft control, releasing bombs automatically at the computed moment. However, this sophistication came with significant operational costs that German testing revealed clearly. The Norden's complex setup procedures, multiple components requiring separate maintenance, and delicate precision mechanisms demanded highly trained operators and extensive support infrastructure. American bombardiers received months of specialized training just to operate the device competently. Maintenance required skilled technicians with extensive knowledge of gyroscopic systems, optical instruments, and delicate mechanical computers. The Lotfe 7's simpler design reduced training requirements and maintenance complexity substantially. German bombardiers could become proficient with the system more quickly, and field maintenance could be accomplished by technicians with general mechanical knowledge rather than specialists in precision instruments. By February 1943, Rechlin had accumulated sufficient data to produce comparative evaluations that circulated through Luftwaffe technical branches and the Reich Air Ministry. These classified reports documented a sobering conclusion. The legendary American Norden bombsight represented sophisticated engineering applied to create a complex solution to the bombing problem. German engineers had developed a simpler, more practical solution that achieved comparable results with less complexity and lower operational support requirements. This realization triggered a fundamental question among German engineers and intelligence analysts. If American technological advantage didn't come from superior bombsight design, what explained the devastating effectiveness of American strategic bombing against German targets? The answer emerged gradually through 1943 as intelligence reports, prisoner interrogations, and analysis of American industrial capacity revealed the truth. American success came not from revolutionary technology, but from overwhelming industrial production, combined with sustainable operational doctrine. American factories were producing Norden bombsights at rates German industry couldn't begin to match. Final production totaled nearly 90,000 units, each consisting of over 2,000 precisely manufactured parts. The program cost exceeded $1.1 billion in 1940s currency, roughly half the expenditure of the Manhattan Project that developed atomic weapons. This scale of production was incomprehensible to German planners. Carl Zeiss had manufactured perhaps 15,000 Lotfe 7 bombsights during the entire war, constrained by manufacturing capacity, material shortages, and competing demands for precision optical instruments. American industry produced 6 times that quantity of a far more complex device, while simultaneously manufacturing aircraft, engines, and every other component needed to equip the largest air force in history. The captured Norden revealed another American advantage that German engineers grudgingly acknowledged: manufacturing quality and precision that German factories struggled to match under wartime conditions. Every component showed careful machining, proper heat treatment, and attention to detail in assembly. The gyroscopes spun smoothly without vibration. Gear trains meshed precisely without backlash. Optical elements showed no distortion or defects. This manufacturing excellence reflected decades of American precision instrument industry development, particularly in automotive manufacturing, where volume production of complex mechanisms had reached maturity German industry never achieved. American engineers designed for mass production, accepting slightly increased complexity if it enabled automated manufacturing and consistent quality. German manufacturing emphasized craftsmanship and manual skill, producing excellent results in small quantities but struggling to maintain quality during high-volume wartime production. Every Lotfe 7 required skilled technicians to assemble and calibrate, limiting production rates. The simpler German design partially compensated for these manufacturing limitations, but couldn't overcome the fundamental industrial capacity difference. Additional captured Norden bombsights reached Rechlin through 1943 and 1944 as more American bombers fell into German hands. Each underwent similar technical examination, building a comprehensive database of American bombsight development and manufacturing techniques. German engineers studied minor variations between production batches, analyzed improvements in later models, and attempted to understand American quality control procedures that maintained such consistent manufacturing standards. Testing expanded to include actual bombing trials, comparing Norden and Lotfe 7 performance under controlled conditions. German test crews dropped practice bombs from captured B-17 seconds using the Norden, then repeated identical runs in German bombers using the Lot for 7. The results under ideal conditions, SMA, clear weather, no combat stress, experienced crews, SMA, showed little practical difference in accuracy between the two systems. Both bomb sites could achieve circular error probable measurements around 300 feet from 20,000 feet altitude under perfect conditions. This represented good performance for mechanical bomb sites of that era, but fell far short of the pickle barrel accuracy, American propaganda claimed. The Norden's reputation exceeded its actual capability by a substantial margin. Weather conditions particularly affected both systems. Cloud cover obscuring targets rendered precision bombing impossible, regardless of bomb site sophistication. European weather, with frequent overcast and limited visibility, degraded bombing accuracy far more than bomb site limitations. German test reports noted that American claims of precision bombing became meaningless when bombardiers couldn't actually see their targets through clouds. Combat conditions further degraded performance for both systems. Anti-aircraft fire forced evasive maneuvers that disrupted the stable flight paths both bomb sites required for accuracy. Fighter attacks prevented bombardiers from maintaining continuous target tracking. Operational stress affected crew performance in ways impossible to replicate during peacetime testing. By mid-1943, German intelligence had assembled a comprehensive picture of American strategic bombing doctrine and the Norden's actual role in it. The bomb site was one component in a larger system that emphasized mass raids, saturation bombing of area targets, and overwhelming defensive firepower from massed bomber formations. The Americans had essentially created an aerial artillery system where hundreds of bombers attacked the same target simultaneously, compensating for individual bombing inaccuracy through sheer volume of explosives delivered. Lead bombardiers in formation used the Norden to aim at targets, while other bombardiers simply released bombs when they saw the lead aircraft's bombs fall. This technique, called formation bombing, achieved acceptable area coverage while simplifying training requirements for the majority of bombardiers. German intelligence reports noted the irony. America's most closely guarded military secret achieved its effectiveness not through revolutionary precision, but through being manufactured in quantities that made it ubiquitous throughout the bomber force. Every B-17 Flying Fortress carried a Norden. Every B-24 Liberator mounted one in its nose. The device's true advantage was availability, not technical superiority. The security surrounding the Norden began to appear increasingly theatrical as German understanding grew. Bombardiers took dramatic oaths to protect the secret with their lives. Armed guards escorted bomb sites to and from aircraft. Elaborate storage vaults housed the devices between missions. Thermite grenades installed in bombers would allegedly melt the Norden into useless slag if the aircraft fell into enemy hands. All this elaborate security protected a device whose complete specifications German intelligence had possessed since November 1938. The Americans were safeguarding a secret that was no secret at all, mounting an expensive security program to protect information the enemy already knew. German engineers at Rechlin debated whether the Americans understood this reality. Did American intelligence know that the Norden specifications had been compromised? If so, why continue the elaborate security measures? If not, why had German analysis of the stolen specifications never leaked back to alert American counterintelligence? The most likely explanation appeared to be that the Norden's security served purposes beyond actually protecting technical secrets. The elaborate measures reinforced public perception of the device as a revolutionary war-winning weapon, supporting morale and justifying the massive expenditure on strategic bombing programs. The security also diverted German intelligence resources towards stealing information Germany already possessed, potentially drawing attention away from programs where American technology genuinely exceeded German capabilities. By late 1943, The pattern had become clear to German technical intelligence analysts. The Norden represented American engineering competence applied to create a working solution to the high-altitude precision bombing problem. German engineers had developed a comparable, in some ways superior solution. American industrial capacity transformed their adequate bombsight into a decisive advantage by manufacturing it in overwhelming quantities, while simultaneously producing the aircraft, crews, and support infrastructure to employ it effectively. The Luftwaffe faced American bombers whose individual technological capabilities were rarely superior to German equivalents, but whose sheer numbers and sustainable operational tempo overwhelmed German defences. For every Norden bomb site German engineers examined at Rechlin, American factories produced hundreds more. For every B-17 shot down over Germany, American industry built 10 replacements. This industrial reality, not technological innovation, explained American bombing effectiveness. German engineers understood this intellectually by mid-1943, but understanding didn't provide solutions to counter it. Germany lacked the industrial capacity, raw materials, and secure production facilities to match American output. Strategic bombing progressively destroyed German manufacturing capability, creating a downward spiral where decreasing production enabled more effective enemy attacks, further reducing German industrial capacity. The captured Norden bomb sites at Rechlin became symbols of this imbalance. German engineers could match or exceed American technical innovation. They could not match American industrial execution. The operational history of both bomb sites through 1943 and 1944 confirmed what German testing had suggested. Neither device achieved the legendary accuracy their designers had promised. Both performed adequately under ideal conditions and poorly under the combat conditions that dominated actual operations. Statistical analysis, compiled by Luftwaffe intelligence, told a sobering story. During 1943, the 8th Air Force achieved an average circular error probable of approximately 1,200 feet from 20,000 feet altitude. Only 31.8% of bombs dropped fell within 1,000 feet of their aim points. This performance matched German bombing accuracy using the Lotfe 7 under similar conditions. The factors degrading accuracy had little to do with bomb site design. Cloud cover obscured targets on approximately 60% of missions over Germany. Anti-aircraft fire forced constant course corrections during bombing runs. Fighter attacks prevented bombardiers from maintaining continuous target tracking. Crew fatigue affected performance significantly. Bombardiers flew long, cold missions at high altitude while wearing bulky flight suits, operating complex instruments with gloved hands in cramped, vibrating aircraft compartments. German intelligence collected testimony from captured American bombardiers throughout 1943 and 1944. These interrogations revealed that most American crews understood the Norden's actual capabilities bore little resemblance to propaganda claims. One interrogation report from April 1944 contained particularly revealing testimony from a B-17 bombardier shot down during a raid on Schweinfurt. They told us in bombardier school that we could hit a pickle barrel. In combat, I was happy if my bombs fell within a quarter mile of the target. Most of the time, I couldn't even see the target through clouds or smoke. By late 1944, the Norden's security classification had been effectively meaningless for years. Hundreds of bomb sites had fallen into German hands. The FBI's arrest of the Duquesne spy ring in June 1941 had been widely publicized, revealing that German intelligence had penetrated the Norden program before American entry into the war. The propaganda dimension of the Norden increasingly interested German intelligence analysts. The bomb site served as a symbol, justifying massive resources devoted to strategic bombing and reassuring American politicians and public that precision attacks minimized civilian casualties. Internal American documents captured during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 contained frank assessments of bombing accuracy that contradicted public statements. These classified reports acknowledged that precision bombing had largely failed, forcing adoption of area bombing techniques similar to British practices. The Americans had quietly shifted doctrine from precision attacks on specific factories to area attacks on entire industrial complexes and urban areas. They continued using the Norden because it provided adequate accuracy for area bombing while maintaining the public fiction of precision warfare. The device's reputation served American strategic communication needs better than it served tactical bombing requirements. German test pilots continued flying captured B-17 seconds through late 1944, using Norden bombsights for both evaluation and actual combat operations with Kampfgeschwader 200. These missions provided final confirmation of German technical assessments. The Norden performed adequately in German hands, achieving accuracy comparable to German bombsights, but offering no dramatic performance advantages. KG-200 pilots noted that the Norden required more extensive maintenance than the Lotfe 7, particularly in the stabilization platform gyroscopes that needed frequent calibration. German ground crews, lacking specialized training and proper maintenance equipment, struggled to keep captured Norden bombsights functioning reliably. These maintenance difficulties confirmed German engineering philosophy, favoring simpler, more maintainable designs over theoretically superior but operationally complex systems. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By January 1945, as Allied armies approached from east and west, Rechlin prepared for evacuation. The Norden bombsights, once considered treasure troves of enemy technology, now represented only historical curiosities. German engineers understood everything about Norden design that mattered, and that understanding had long since ceased providing any advantage against overwhelming Allied material superiority. American intelligence teams sweeping through defeated Germany in May 1945 discovered German files documenting the Norden espionage operation and subsequent technical analysis. These files revealed for the first time that Hermann Lang had passed complete specifications to German intelligence in November 1938. The captured documentation confirmed that Germany had possessed complete Norden information years before American bombers began operations over Europe. This discovery prompted immediate questioning about whether elaborate Norden security measures had served any useful purpose. American military intelligence concluded that Norden security had protected nothing of value from enemies while serving primarily as psychological operations, supporting domestic morale and justifying massive program expenditures. Post-war technical debriefings of German engineers confirmed that stolen Norden specifications had influenced Carl Zeiss's development of the Lotfe 7, but primarily by suggesting what approaches to avoid. German engineers had studied American design choices and deliberately rejected many of them, choosing simpler implementations even when American approaches offered theoretical performance advantages. Events had validated this judgment. Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner, the Carl Zeiss engineer who conducted initial examination of the captured Norden in December 1942, survived the war and provided extensive testimony to American technical intelligence in June 1945. His assessment summarized German professional opinion. The Norden represents excellent engineering, solving the precision bombing problem through sophisticated mechanical computation and gyroscopic stabilization. German engineers made different design choices emphasizing simplicity and maintainability over complexity and theoretical performance. Both approaches achieved comparable practical results. American advantage came not from superior bombsight technology, but from industrial capacity to produce advanced equipment in overwhelming quantities. The story of German examination of the captured Norden bombsight reveals multiple layers of irony. American security protected a device whose specifications the enemy already possessed. American propaganda promoted capabilities the device couldn't achieve. German engineers developed a simpler, more practical solution to the same problem, yet still lost the war because industrial capacity mattered more than design elegance. The fundamental lesson German engineers learned had little to do with bombsight technology. They discovered that American success came from sustainable industrial practices that Germany couldn't match. American engineers designed for mass production, accepting complexity where it enabled automated manufacturing and consistent quality. American factories produced adequate technology in overwhelming quantities, rather than pursuing perfect technology in limited numbers. German engineering philosophy emphasized optimization and elegance, creating theoretically superior solutions that proved difficult to manufacture in quantity. The Lotfe 7 represented this philosophy, simpler, more elegant, easier to maintain than the Norden. Yet Germany lost because simpler bomb sites couldn't compensate for having fewer bombers, fewer crews, fewer bombs, and progressively fewer functional factories, as Allied strategic bombing destroyed German industrial capacity. The Norden had never been a revolutionary secret weapon. It was an adequate solution, manufactured in quantities that made it ubiquitous throughout American bomber forces. Its legendary reputation served propaganda purposes more effectively than its actual performance served bombing accuracy. The elaborate security surrounding it protected information the enemy already possessed, while diverting attention from programs where American advantages were genuine. The mathematics were simple and brutal. One excellent bomb sight in one bomber destroyed in combat achieved nothing. 10,000 adequate bomb sites in 10,000 bombers overwhelmed any defense. American success came from understanding this arithmetic and organizing industrial capacity to implement it. The Norden represented American industrial philosophy applied to military technology. Design it well enough, manufacture it consistently, produce it in overwhelming quantity. This approach lacked the intellectual elegance German engineers valued, but it won wars. German engineers learned this lesson well. By then it was far too late to matter. Post-war analysis revealed final irony. The Norden cost approximately $1.1 billion to develop and produce, roughly equivalent to $17 billion in current currency. This massive expenditure created a device that achieved combat accuracy barely exceeding what simpler, cheaper bomb sights provided. Yet the program succeeded brilliantly at its actual purpose, providing American leadership with justification for strategic bombing doctrine, reassuring Congress and public that precision attacks minimized civilian casualties, and maintaining support for massive resource allocation to bomber production. In this sense, the elaborate security protecting the Norden served genuine purpose despite protecting no real secrets. The security reinforced public perception of the device as revolutionary, supporting the mythology that justified strategic bombing programs. German possession of complete specifications mattered less than American public belief in the bomb site's decisive capabilities. German engineers examining captured Norden bomb sites understood the technical reality but missed the larger strategic picture. They correctly assessed that the Norden provided no significant technical advantage. They failed to recognize that the device's primary value was never technical but rather psychological and political, serving purposes far removed from actual bombing accuracy. The Norden stood as testament to American understanding of how industrial democracies fight wars. Design it well enough, manufacture it consistently, produce it overwhelmingly, promote it effectively, deploy it ruthlessly. This formula won World War II more decisively than any individual weapon's technical capabilities. December 14, 1942, when German engineers climbed into the captured B-17 Wolfhound at Leeuwarden Airfield, expecting to discover the secret of American bombing effectiveness, they found instead that there was no secret. The Americans had built a competent device using principles German engineers understood thoroughly. They had manufactured it in quantities German industry couldn't match. They had deployed it with industrial ruthlessness that rendered individual equipment capabilities almost irrelevant. One excellent bomb sight in one bomber achieved nothing. 10,000 adequate bomb sites in 10,000 bombers overwhelmed any defense. German engineers documented this lesson in detailed technical reports that gathered dust in archives while Germany collapsed. The lesson had been learned too late to matter. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. April 19th, 1945. Forward Medical Station, Leyte Island, Philippines. Captain Helen Frazier pressed 2 fingers against the wrist of a young Japanese woman lying motionless on a canvas stretcher. The pulse was rapid, thready, barely perceptible beneath skin that burned with fever. 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermometer confirmed what Frazier already knew from years of nursing combat casualties. Without intervention, this woman would be dead by morning. The patient's name was Michiko Tanaka, 23 years old, a civilian nurse conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps in 1943. She had been captured 3 days earlier when American forces overran a field hospital near Ormoc. Now she lay dying, not from battle wounds, but from an infected laceration on her left leg, a wound so minor it should never have killed anyone. The gash, no more than 3 inches long, had turned septic. Red streaks of lymphangitis climbed toward her thigh. Blood poisoning, septicemia. Around Tanaka's stretcher, 11 other Japanese women sat in frightened silence. They were nurses, all of them, captured alongside their dying friend. They had watched her fever climb for 2 days. They had cleaned her wound with boiled water and wrapped it in clean bandages torn from American supplies. Nothing had worked. In their eyes, Captain Frazier could see resignation. They had accepted that Michiko would die, the way soldiers accepted death in war, the way their training had taught them to accept loss without protest. What happened next would shatter everything these women had been taught about their enemy, about American barbarism, about the inevitable fate of prisoners who fell into Western hands. Captain Frazier reached into her medical kit and withdrew a small glass vial filled with yellowish powder, penicillin, the miracle drug that was saving thousands of Allied soldiers from infections that would have killed them in any previous war. She dissolved the powder in sterile water, drew it into a syringe, and administered the first injection into Michiko's arm. The other Japanese nurses leaned forward, watching with expressions that mixed hope and disbelief. One of them, a woman named Keiko Yamamoto who spoke limited English, whispered a question. "Medicine?" "For her?" Frazier nodded. "Yes, for her. We're going to try to save her life." The words seemed impossible to the women who heard them. Everything they had been told, everything drilled into them during training, had emphasized that capture meant death or worse. Japanese military doctrine stated explicitly that prisoners could expect no mercy from Americans. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The propaganda had been relentless. American soldiers, they were told, were devils who tortured prisoners, who violated women, who showed no humanity toward the defeated. Better to die fighting, better to take your own life, than to fall into enemy hands. The military police, the Kempeitai, had reinforced this message with stories of atrocities, with warnings that surrender meant degradation and death. Every Japanese soldier and nurse carried this belief like armor against the temptation to give up. Yet here was an American nurse, administering precious medicine to save a Japanese prisoner's life. The contradiction was profound. Captain Helen Frazier had arrived in the Philippines in January 1945 with the 6th Army's Medical Corps. Born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, she had trained at the Army School of Nursing in 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor. She had seen action in New Guinea, where jungle diseases killed as many men as Japanese bullets. She had treated Allied soldiers torn apart by shrapnel, burned by flamethrowers, ravaged by malaria and dysentery. She had also treated Japanese prisoners, though they were rare. Most Japanese soldiers chose death over capture. Those who survived to reach American medical stations often refused treatment, expecting execution. Frazier had watched Japanese wounded turn their faces to the wall and wait for death rather than accept help from the enemy. It was a psychological barrier, as impenetrable as any fortification. The penicillin in her medical kit represented a revolution in warfare medicine. Discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, penicillin had remained a laboratory curiosity until 1942, when mass production began in the United States. By 1944, American factories were producing enough penicillin to treat wounded soldiers across multiple theaters of war. The drug transformed battlefield medicine. Infections that had killed soldiers in World War I, gangrene, septicemia, pneumonia, could now be stopped with a series of injections. The survival rate for wounded soldiers increased dramatically. Men who would have died in previous wars now lived to fight again or return home. For the Allied Medical Corps, penicillin was the single most important advancement of the war, more valuable than any weapon. But penicillin was scarce. Production had increased, but demand remained enormous. Every vial was allocated carefully, reserved for Allied wounded. Using penicillin on enemy prisoners was not standard protocol. Some medical officers argued it was wasteful, even immoral, to give critical supplies to enemy combatants when Allied soldiers might need them. Yet Captain Frazier, like many American medical personnel, followed a different principle. The Hippocratic Oath made no distinction between ally and enemy. A patient was a patient. A life was a life. When Michiko Tanaka arrived at the medical station with clear signs of septicemia, Frazier made her decision without hesitation. She would treat the infection with the same aggressive approach she used for American soldiers. Penicillin, administered every 4 hours, combined with intravenous fluids and careful wound management. If the drug worked, Tanaka would live. If it failed, at least they would have tried. The first 24 hours were critical. Frazier monitored Tanaka's vital signs constantly: temperature, pulse, respiration, the indicators of whether the infection was retreating or advancing. The other Japanese nurses remained nearby, sleeping on the ground beside their friend's stretcher, refusing to leave despite offers of more comfortable quarters. They watched every injection, every temperature check, every adjustment of the intravenous line. Keiko Yamamoto, the English speaker, asked questions. What was the medicine? How did it work? Would Michiko survive? Frazier answered honestly. The medicine was called penicillin. It killed the bacteria causing the infection. Whether Michiko survived depended on how quickly the drug could stop the spread of poison in her blood. By the morning of April 20th, 36 hours after the first injection, Michiko's fever had dropped to 101 degrees. The red streaks on her leg had stopped advancing. Her pulse was stronger, more regular. She opened her eyes and spoke weakly in Japanese. The other nurses crowded around her stretcher, tears streaming down their faces. They touched her hands, stroked her hair, spoke rapidly in words Captain Frazier couldn't understand but whose meaning was unmistakable. Relief. Joy. Keiko Yamamoto turned to Frazier, her face wet with tears. She bowed deeply, the formal bow of profound respect, and spoke in halting English. Thank you. We thought she would die. We thought you would let her die. You saved her. Why? The question hung in the air. Why would an American nurse use precious medicine to save an enemy prisoner? Why show mercy to people who had been trained to expect none? Frazier's answer was simple, delivered in the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. Because she's a patient, because she's a human being, because it's what we do. The words seemed to stagger the Japanese women. They looked at each other, then back at Frazier, then at Michiko lying on the stretcher with colour returning to her cheeks. Something fundamental had broken in that moment. A belief system, carefully constructed through years of propaganda and military indoctrination, had collided with an undeniable reality. The enemy was not what they had been told. The Americans were not the monsters of official narrative. Over the following days, as Michiko's condition continued to improve, the psychological transformation among the Japanese nurses became more apparent. They began speaking more freely with the American medical staff. They asked about medical techniques, about supplies, about the organization of American field hospitals. What they discovered shocked them. American medical stations were supplied with equipment and medicines that Japanese field hospitals could only dream of. Sulfur drugs, plasma for transfusions, surgical instruments, anesthetics, all available in quantities that seemed impossible. The contrast was stark. Japanese military medicine had become increasingly primitive as the war progressed. Supplies were scarce. Medicines were rationed to the point of uselessness. Wounded soldiers often received minimal care because there was nothing available to treat them with. The Japanese nurses had learned to make do with inadequate resources, to watch men die from treatable conditions, to accept loss as inevitable. They had been told this was because Japan's resources were directed toward winning the war, toward final victory that would justify all sacrifices. But seeing American abundance, understanding that the enemy had so much that they could spare advanced medicine for prisoners, forced a reckoning. If America could afford to treat enemy wounded with miracle drugs, what did that say about Japan's chances of winning? What did it say about the propaganda that promised victory despite hardship? The psychological impact extended beyond medical supplies. The Japanese nurses observed how American medical personnel treated patients. There was no brutality, no casual cruelty, no contempt for the wounded. American doctors and nurses worked with the same careful attention to detail whether treating an American soldier or a Japanese prisoner. When supplies allowed, Japanese wounded received the same level of care as Allied wounded. This was not propaganda. This was not performance for observers. This was simply how American military medicine operated. The principle of treating all patients equally, regardless of nationality, was embedded in American military medical training. It was codified in regulations, emphasized in instruction, and practiced consistently. Captain Frazier and her colleagues were not exceptional in their treatment of Michiko Tanaka. They were following standard American military medical protocol. But to the Japanese nurses, who had been trained in a system where resources were scarce and enemy lives were worthless, this approach seemed revolutionary. It challenged everything they understood about warfare, about national loyalty, about the nature of the enemy they were fighting. By April 25th, 6 days after receiving her first penicillin injection, Michiko Tanaka was sitting up, eating solid food, and speaking in full sentences. The infection had been completely eradicated. The wound on her leg was healing cleanly. She would recover fully, would survive the war, would return eventually to Japan, and live a long life. All because an American nurse had decided to use a few vials of penicillin to save an enemy prisoner's life. The story of what happened spread through the prisoner of war camp where the Japanese nurses were held. Other prisoners heard about the American medicine that had saved Michiko's life. They heard about the American nurses who had treated her with respect and care. The psychological impact rippled outward, challenging the fortress of propaganda that had convinced Japanese soldiers and civilians that surrender meant torture and death. Some prisoners remained skeptical, believing the story was Allied propaganda designed to encourage surrender. But those who saw Michiko, who spoke with the nurses who had witnessed her treatment, could not deny the evidence. The Americans had the capacity to kill. They had the military power to annihilate prisoners without consequence. Yet they chose to heal instead. The context of what happened at that Leyte medical station in April 1945 requires understanding the brutal mathematics of Japanese military medicine. By the spring of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army's medical system had collapsed under the weight of attrition, dwindling resources, and strategic isolation. What had once been a functional, if Spartan, medical infrastructure had deteriorated into something barely recognizable as organized healthcare. In 1941, when Japan's military expansion was at its peak, Japanese field hospitals operated with reasonable efficiency. They had access to imported medicines, trained surgeons, and supply lines that, while never as robust as American logistics, were adequate for treating wounded soldiers. Japanese military doctors had studied Western medicine, understood modern surgical techniques, and applied them competently within the constraints of available resources. But by 1943, those supply lines had begun to fracture. American submarines were strangling Japanese merchant shipping. Medicines that had been imported from Europe or synthesized in Japanese factories became increasingly scarce. Sulfur drugs, morphine, anesthetics, all became precious commodities rationed so severely that many wounded soldiers received no pain relief at all. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia, holding down screaming patients while cutting through flesh and bone. The statistics were grim. In 1944, the Japanese army estimated that 60% of combat deaths resulted not from immediate battle wounds, but from infections and disease that could have been treated with adequate medical supplies. Soldiers died from infected wounds that would have been survivable with antibiotics. They died from malaria that could have been controlled with quinine. They died from dysentery, from gangrene, from septicemia, from preventable conditions that turned fatal because there was nothing available to treat them with. Japanese military nurses, like Michiko Tanaka and her colleagues, were trained to function in this environment of scarcity. Their instruction emphasized improvisation, making do with minimal resources, accepting that many patients would die simply because there was no medicine to save them. They learned to use boiled water and clean bandages as their primary tools. They learned to comfort dying men because comfort was often all they could offer. They learned to suppress their emotions, to view death as inevitable rather than tragic. This was not callousness, it was survival. A nurse who grieved for every patient she lost would break under the psychological weight. The military training deliberately hardened them, teaching them to accept loss without question, to continue functioning despite constant exposure to suffering and death. It was a brutal but necessary adaptation to circumstances where resources could not match need. The propaganda that accompanied this medical scarcity was carefully constructed. Japanese soldiers and medical personnel were told that hardship was noble, that suffering demonstrated dedication to the emperor and the nation. They were taught that Western dependence on technology and abundant supplies represented weakness, a lack of spiritual strength. Japan would prevail, the narrative insisted, through superior willpower and dedication, through acceptance of sacrifice that soft Western nations could never match. The medical system's failures were reframed as proof of character, rather than evidence of strategic collapse. When wounded soldiers died from lack of medicine, it was presented as honorable sacrifice rather than preventable tragedy. When nurses worked without adequate supplies, they were praised for their devotion rather than pitied for being placed in impossible situations. The propaganda created a psychological fortress that protected military personnel from recognizing the full extent of their disadvantage. This fortress made what Captain Frazier did even more devastating to the Japanese nurses who witnessed it. The abundance of American medical supplies, the casual use of advanced medicine to save an enemy prisoner's life, the efficient organization of the field hospital, all of it directly contradicted everything they had been taught. If America had so much that they could waste it on prisoners, what did that say about Japan's claim of superior spirit overcoming material disadvantage? If American nurses could afford to be merciful, what did that say about the necessity of Japanese hardship? The cognitive dissonance was profound. April 27, 1945, the prisoner of war camp, Leyte. Major Robert Chen of the Military Intelligence Service conducted his first formal interview with the Japanese nurses. Chen, a Nisei officer born in California to Japanese immigrant parents, spoke fluent Japanese and had conducted hundreds of prisoner interrogations throughout the Pacific Campaign. He had learned to recognize the psychological patterns, the stages prisoners went through as their indoctrination confronted reality. What he observed with the nurses captured at Ormoc was different. These were not soldiers hardened by combat, not fanatics who maintained their beliefs against all evidence. These were medical professionals whose entire worldview had been shattered by a single act of mercy. Keiko Yamamoto spoke for the group, her words translated by Chen for the official record. We were taught that Americans were barbaric, that they had no honor, that they treated prisoners with cruelty and contempt. We were told that if captured, we should expect torture or death. Every training session emphasized this. Every propaganda film we watched showed American soldiers as monsters. When we were captured, we expected the worst. When Michiko became sick, we thought we would have to watch her die. We had no medicine. We assumed the Americans would give us none. She paused, searching for words to describe what happened next. Then Captain Frazier treated her. She used medicine, valuable medicine, to save Michiko's life. She checked on her constantly, like Michiko was her own patient, like she mattered. We could not understand it. Why would the enemy save one of us? We asked ourselves if it was a trick, if they were saving her so they could use her for propaganda or interrogation, but no one asked Michiko questions about military information. No one demanded anything in return for the treatment. They just saved her life because she was sick. The impact of this realization was evident in Yamamoto's voice, recorded in Chen's report. Everything we were told was a lie. The Americans are not monsters. They have honor. They have mercy. They treated us better than our own military treated us. We had nurses in our unit who died from infections because we had no medicine. The army told us there was no choice, that we had to accept these deaths. But the Americans had medicine. They had so much medicine they could give it to us, their enemies. How can we believe anything we were told when this one thing, this most important thing, was completely false? Major Chen's report to intelligence headquarters emphasized the propaganda value of this incident. The psychological impact of medical treatment on Japanese prisoners cannot be overstated. These individuals have experienced a fundamental collapse of their belief system. They are now questioning not just specific military claims, but the entire narrative structure of Japanese propaganda. Recommendation: where medical supplies allow, continue treating Japanese prisoners with the same standard of care provided to Allied wounded. The intelligence and propaganda benefits justify the resource expenditure. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The recommendation was not purely cynical. American military medical personnel genuinely believed in treating all patients according to medical need rather than nationality, but intelligence officers recognized that this principle had strategic benefits. Every Japanese prisoner who received competent medical care became a potential source of accurate information about American treatment of prisoners. Every story of American mercy that filtered back to Japanese lines weakened the propaganda that convinced soldiers to fight to the death rather than surrender. The mathematics were brutal but clear. A Japanese soldier who believed surrender meant torture would fight until killed, inflicting maximum Allied casualties. A Japanese soldier who believed surrender might mean survival and humane treatment might choose to give up, reducing Allied casualties while removing an enemy combatant from the battlefield. Medical treatment of prisoners was not just humanitarian principle but strategic calculation, though the two motives were not mutually exclusive. The broader pattern of American medical treatment of Japanese prisoners was documented extensively throughout the Pacific Campaign. At the prisoner of war camp on Guam, American doctors treated Japanese wounded with the same aggressive approach used for Allied casualties. Surgeons performed complex operations to save limbs that Japanese military doctors would have simply amputated. Patients received pain medication, proper nutrition, and physical therapy during recovery. The survival rate for Japanese wounded in American care was significantly higher than for similar wounds treated in Japanese field hospitals. On Okinawa, where fighting was particularly brutal and casualties were enormous, American medical personnel established a separate facility for treating Japanese prisoners. The facility was staffed with doctors and nurses who could have been assigned to Allied hospitals, but were instead dedicated to enemy wounded. When supplies were strained, as they frequently were during heavy fighting, the allocation system prioritized based on medical need rather than nationality. A Japanese prisoner with a life-threatening wound received treatment before an Allied soldier with a minor injury. This approach was not universal among American personnel. Some officers and enlisted men resented resources being devoted to enemy prisoners. Some argued that every bullet, every bandage, every vial of medicine used on a Japanese prisoner was one less available for Allied soldiers. The tension between humanitarian principle and resource allocation was real and ongoing, but military medical regulations were clear. Prisoners were to be treated according to the Geneva Convention standards, which required proper medical care. American military culture, shaped by civilian values and legal traditions, generally enforced these standards, even when they conflicted with immediate tactical interests. The contrast with Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners was stark and well documented. Allied prisoners of war in Japanese custody faced systematic neglect and abuse. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Wounded prisoners were left to die from infections, from malaria, from malnutrition. Japanese military doctrine held that soldiers who surrendered had forfeited their right to honorable treatment. Prison camps operated with minimal resources, and what resources existed were reserved for Japanese personnel. The death rate among Allied prisoners in Japanese custody was approximately 27%, compared to less than 4% for Axis prisoners in Allied custody. This was not merely the result of resource scarcity. It reflected fundamental differences in how the two sides viewed prisoners and warfare itself. The Japanese military operated on principles derived from Bushido, the warrior code that emphasized death before dishonor. Surrender was seen as the ultimate dishonor, proof of moral weakness. Prisoners, whether Japanese soldiers who had been captured or enemy prisoners in Japanese custody, were viewed with contempt. They had failed the fundamental test of warrior spirit. This philosophical framework made the concept of humane treatment for prisoners nearly incomprehensible within Japanese military culture. When Japanese nurses like Michiko Tanaka and her colleagues encountered American medical treatment that contradicted everything they had been taught, the psychological impact was devastating in the truest sense. It devastated their existing belief structure, forced them to rebuild their understanding of the war, of their enemy, of the validity of their own nation's claims. Some prisoners couldn't make this adjustment. They rejected the evidence before their eyes, insisting that American kindness was manipulation, that mercy was a trick designed to extract information or create propaganda. But medical treatment was difficult to dismiss as manipulation. When a nurse used precious medicine to save your friend's life, when a doctor spent hours in surgery to repair damage that could have been ignored, when the care was consistent and ongoing rather than performative, the evidence became undeniable. The Americans were different. The propaganda had been lies. By May 1945, Michiko Tanaka had recovered sufficiently to be transferred to the main prisoner of war facility on Leyte. She walked out of the medical station under her own power, her infected leg completely healed, her life saved by medicine that shouldn't have been wasted on an enemy prisoner according to the logic she had been raised with. The other Japanese nurses accompanied her, 11 women whose understanding of the world had been fundamentally altered by watching their friend receive competent medical care from the enemy they had been taught to hate and fear. Captain Helen Frazier never learned what became of Michiko Tanaka after the war. The chaos of Japan's surrender, the massive repatriation efforts, the destruction of records, all made it impossible to track individual prisoners once they returned home. Frazier continued her medical service through the end of the war, treating wounded soldiers in the Philippines and later in the occupation of Japan itself. She returned to Iowa in 1946, resumed her civilian nursing career, and rarely spoke publicly about her wartime service. But in 1978, 33 years after the incident, Frazier received a letter. It had been forwarded through military archives, through veterans organizations, through a chain of connections that took months to complete. The letter was from Japan, written in careful English by a woman named Keiko Yamamoto. Yamamoto explained that she had been searching for years, trying to find the American nurse who had saved Michiko Tanaka's life. She had contacted veterans groups, written to military hospitals, followed every lead until she finally located Captain Helen Frazier, now retired and living in Cedar Rapids. The letter described what had happened after the war. Michiko Tanaka had returned to Japan in late 1945, one of thousands of repatriated prisoners who filtered back into a nation devastated by defeat. She had resumed nursing, working in civilian hospitals in Tokyo, treating patients in the ruins of a shattered country. She had married, raised children, lived a full life that would have ended at 23 years old on a stretcher in the Philippines, if not for American penicillin. Yamamoto wrote, "Michiko passed away in 1976. Before she died, she asked me to find you if I could. She wanted you to know that she never forgot what you did. She told her children about the American nurse who saved her life when she should have been left to die. She told them that the war taught her that human kindness can exist even between enemies, that mercy is stronger than hatred." The letter continued, "All of us who were there, all of us who watched you treat Michiko, we carried that memory through the rest of our lives. When we returned to Japan and saw the devastation, when we learned how completely we had been lied to about the war, we understood that what you did was not unusual for Americans. You treated prisoners with humanity because that is who you are. We were told you were monsters. You showed us that the monsters were the lies we had been taught to believe." Frazier kept the letter until her death in 1994. It was found among her personal effects, carefully preserved in a folder with her military discharge papers and commendations. Her family donated it to the National World War II Museum, where it remains in the archives, a testament to a moment when medicine transcended warfare, when professional duty proved stronger than national hatred. The broader significance of incidents like Michiko Tanaka's treatment extended beyond individual lives saved. American medical treatment of Japanese prisoners contributed to the gradual erosion of Japanese military morale in the final months of the war. As more prisoners survived to tell stories of humane treatment, as more evidence accumulated that surrender did not mean torture or death, the psychological barriers that kept Japanese soldiers fighting to the last man began to crack. The number of Japanese soldiers surrendering increased steadily through 1945. In the final months of the war, entire units began giving up rather than fighting to annihilation. This was partly due to hopeless tactical situations, but it was also enabled by changing perceptions about what capture meant. Leaflets dropped by American aircraft included testimonials from Japanese prisoners describing their treatment, including medical care they received. Some Japanese soldiers dismissed these as propaganda, but others, facing certain death if they continued fighting, chose to risk surrender based on the possibility that the testimonials were true. The impact carried forward into the post-war occupation. When American forces occupied Japan in August 1945, they encountered a population that had been taught to expect brutal treatment from the conquerors. Many Japanese civilians fled from advancing American troops, believing they would be killed or enslaved. But the occupation proceeded with remarkable restraint. American military government provided food aid, medical care, and economic assistance to the devastated Japanese population. The contrast between expected barbarism and actual behavior was so stark that it fundamentally reshaped Japanese attitudes toward America. Within years, Japan transformed from bitter enemy to close ally, a shift enabled partly by the accumulated evidence that American actions contradicted Japanese wartime propaganda. Medical treatment had been part of that evidence. Every Japanese prisoner who survived because of American medicine, every family that received a loved one back who should have died, contributed to the psychological foundation for post-war reconciliation. The story of Michiko Tanaka and the American penicillin that saved her life became one small thread in that larger tapestry of transformation. In 1952, 7 years after the war's end, the American Medical Association published a retrospective analysis of military medicine in World War II. The section on treatment of enemy wounded included statistics that told the story in numbers. American military medical facilities in the Pacific Theater had treated approximately 43,000 Japanese prisoners during the war. The survival rate for Japanese wounded in American care was 79%, compared to an estimated 43% survival rate for similar wounds treated in Japanese military hospitals. The difference was attributed to 3 factors: abundant medical supplies, particularly antibiotics like penicillin, well-trained medical personnel, and consistent application of treatment protocols without regard to patient nationality. The report concluded that medical treatment of enemy wounded had been justified both on humanitarian grounds and strategic calculation. The cost in resources had been minimal compared to the intelligence gathered from cooperative prisoners and the propaganda benefits of documented humane treatment. But the report also emphasized that medical personnel had not treated enemy wounded primarily for strategic reasons. They had done so because it was the right thing to do, because their professional ethics demanded it, because American values insisted that even enemies deserved humane treatment when they were helpless and wounded. This principle, the report suggested, was itself a strategic advantage. It meant that American military personnel operated with moral clarity, without the psychological burden of systematic cruelty. It meant that the American way of war, despite its industrial scale and terrible efficiency, retained connection to humanitarian principles that distinguished it from totalitarian approaches to warfare. Today, the principles Captain Helen Frazier followed in April 1945 remain embedded in American military medical doctrine. The treatment of prisoners according to medical need rather than nationality is codified in regulations, emphasized in training, and generally enforced in practice. Modern military medicine has advanced far beyond penicillin and canvas stretchers, but the ethical framework remains constant. A patient is a patient, a life is a life. The duty to heal transcends the circumstance of warfare. In the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Silver Spring, Maryland, a small exhibit displays a vial of penicillin from World War II. The placard explains how this antibiotic revolutionized battlefield medicine, saving countless lives that would have been lost in previous wars. But the exhibit doesn't mention Michiko Tanaka, doesn't tell the story of Japanese nurses who wept with joy when their friend survived because an American captain used precious medicine to save an enemy prisoner. That story exists in archives, in letters, in the memories of those who witnessed it and carried it forward. It exists as one example among thousands of moments when medical professionals chose to honor their calling despite the hatreds of warfare, when human decency proved stronger than propaganda, when mercy demonstrated that even in the depths of total war, some principles remained inviolate. The morning Michiko Tanaka walked out of that medical station on Leyte, her life saved by medicine and mercy, represented more than one woman's survival. It represented the collision of two philosophies of warfare. One philosophy held that enemies were subhuman, that prisoners had forfeited any claim to consideration, that resources should never be wasted on those who had already lost. The other philosophy held that even enemies remained human, that medical ethics transcended national loyalty, that showing mercy to the helpless was strength rather than weakness. The contrast between these philosophies shaped not just battlefield medicine, but the entire character of how America fought World War II. The industrial power, the massive logistics, the overwhelming material advantage, all of these were important. But equally important was the insistence on maintaining humanitarian principles, even within the machinery of total war. The decision to use penicillin on a dying Japanese prisoner was a small decision, made by one captain in one field hospital on one day in April 1945. But it was connected to larger patterns, to a way of thinking about warfare that rejected the totalitarian insistence that victory justified any action, any cruelty, any abandonment of moral constraint. When Japanese nurses watched their friend survive because the enemy chose to save her, they witnessed the practical application of principles they had been taught did not exist. The cognitive dissonance forced them to question everything. If the Americans showed mercy when they could have shown none, what else had they been lied to about? If the enemy had abundant resources while Japan starved, what did that say about which side was truly winning? If medical professionals on both sides took the same oath but only one side honored it consistently, who represented civilization and who represented barbarism? These questions had no comfortable answers for women raised in a system that demanded absolute loyalty, that punished doubt, that insisted on faith in ultimate victory despite all evidence. But the questions, once raised, could not be unasked. The evidence, once seen, could not be unseen. A friend dying was a friend saved. Medicine wasted on an enemy was a life given back. The story ends where it began, with young women facing death in war. But unlike the countless deaths that warfare makes inevitable, this one was prevented. A Japanese nurse who should have died on a stretcher in the Philippines lived instead, returned home, raised a family, and told her children about mercy shown by an enemy who was supposed to be merciless. 11 other nurses carried that memory for the rest of their lives, a memory that challenged everything they had been taught, that forced them to recognize the humanity of those they had been trained to hate. Captain Helen Frazier, who made the decision to use penicillin on Michiko Tanaka, was following protocols, doing her job, applying her training. She was not trying to make a political statement or challenge propaganda. She was simply being a nurse, treating a patient who needed treatment. That this simple professional act became revolutionary says everything about the gulf between American and Japanese military culture, about the contrast between systems that valued individual human life and systems that viewed individuals as expendable resources in service to the state. The penicillin used to save Michiko Tanaka's life cost approximately $3. The strategic value of that expenditure, measured in propaganda impact and intelligence benefits, was incalculable, but the human value, measured in one life saved and 11 others transformed, transcended any calculation of strategic advantage. It was an act of mercy that rippled forward through decades, through families, through the memories of those who witnessed it and understood that even in war, humanity could prevail over hatred. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.